Hey there, folks. Welcome to our discussion group for The Chosen and the Beautiful by Nghi. The Chosen and the Beautiful, for anyone who is watching, is Vo's first full-length novel from Tor.com and is a fantastic retelling of The Great Gatsby from the perspective of Jordan Baker, socialite golf star, and in this retelling, a Vietnamese adoptee into the Baker family. There's a lot more we can say about her, but we'll be getting to that in the discussion. For now, I wanted to do a round of introductions of folks. If you could give me your name, your pronouns, and what you thought of the novel. We'll start with me and then go clockwise in the StreamYard. I'm Stephen, he, him, and I'm facilitating this meeting of the Gauntlet Reading Club. This is my second time reading The Chosen and the Beautiful, and I actually found myself liking it much more this time than on my first reading. I still think I like Vo's novellas more, but I found myself catching a lot of those little interwoven details that I like about Vo's stories, and it kind of missed on my first read through. So yeah, if we could start with you, Kay.
Hi, yes, I'm Kay, and this is my first time reading The Chosen and the Beautiful. I use she, her, or they, them pronouns. I'm pretty flippant there. And I actually really enjoyed it. It's been a long time. I was an avid reader as a youth, and it's been a long time since I really sat down and just read a book for pleasure after the last few years. And yeah, I haven't read anything by Ningbo before, but as someone who grew up on in quote unquote the Egg, Long Island, New York, where a lot of this is sort of based on, and who has spent time in areas where it is, and who did several stories and papers on Gatsby, it was really fun to sort of read a differentiated version with the underlying theme still present, but some other more interesting, more, in my opinion, more modernly known and talked about issues at the forefront.
I'm Maria. I use she, her pronouns. I speed read this book, or not really speed read, but I did dive into it and try to get it done before today. And it had been a long time since I've read The Great Gatsby, but as I was reading it, it was very, it was fun to pick up the parts where it was harking back to my English class, and who knows how long ago that was. But also seeing, I guess I liked the book a lot, and it's the first thing I've read by this author, and I really enjoyed kind of seeing the way that the story and the world had shifted in a way where it was believable in the way that speculative fiction is, but also it's still tone wise and language wise felt true to what I remember vaguely of The Great Gatsby. So yeah.
And yeah, I'm David. I use he, him pronouns. I read this for the book club here, and yeah, I again enjoyed it a lot. I like the kind of the writing style in general. I really liked the kind of. I mean, I guess some of it's less subtle than others, but just the sort of subtle world building stuff that goes on in the background, I thought was really cool, and that was really interesting. I did also, because I sort of finished reading it, and I was like, after getting to the end of it, I was like, I actually can't remember much of what happened in The Great Gatsby. I don't know how much of this was taken from that. So I sort of went back and read The Great Gatsby, and yeah, it was really interesting, sort of reading them side by side. And yeah, I mean, how much of what is in this is actually sort of taken, obviously changed and altered and told from a different perspective, but that there's that kind of strong link there, and I really like that kind of way of taking that story and just telling it from a different direction. It's a really neat idea. So that was cool, and I like kind of some of the different inflections you get on the story from the change of perspective. I thought was cool.
Yeah, and this group is hosted through the Gauntlet. The Gauntlet is an online gaming community mostly focusing on role-playing games of the indie and OSR varieties. Besides publishing a zine called The Codex, it also puts out several podcasts about role-playing games. And of course, it organizes a gaming calendar, which this and many other games are organized through every month. The calendar is open to non-members, so feel free to jump on over there through the link below if you're interested in playing with any of the folks here tonight or any of the other people on the Gauntlet. All Gauntlet sessions make use of an open door policy. We are all here to have fun, and in this case, discuss a book together. If something happens in real life or you become uncomfortable at the table, feel free to step away as long as you need. No one will hold it against you, and you are free to return whenever you feel ready. If you're able to let the group know when you expect to return, that is always helpful, but we understand that sometimes emergencies happen and it's not always possible. Besides the open door, we'll also be making use of several other safety tools over the course of this run, but the main one useful right now to the discussion section is probably the X card. If at any point something is making you uncomfortable, feel free to make an X sign with your arms, type X into the chat, or simply say X card. If someone signals the X card and I haven't noticed, whether because I'm speaking or looking away from the screen, feel free to interrupt me to call my attention to it. Either way, we'll halt the discussion and probably ask to clarify what you are X carding, but there's no need to justify or explain your reasoning beyond that. Are folks cool with those two things? They understand what I'm talking about? Cool. So one of the things that a lot of you brought up, and it was also something I was kind of thinking about, particularly in my first read through, where I was kind of a little bit more hesitant on how much I liked it, was what do you think about the choice? Like, just to begin with, I guess this is a big question, of adapting The Great Gatsby.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of no book as a pillar, which for me is the sense that there is a lot to glean in all texts, and it's sort of, I think, seen negatively to say that all stories have been told, but a lot of things have been told. But just because something's been told once doesn't mean it can't be told differently, and doesn't mean it can't be showing a different side. That's something I think we lose a lot when we sort of switch to this idea of ownership in written form versus oral stories. As someone who spent a large portion of my academic career studying folktales and fairy tales, I think there's a lot that can be said about the same story when it's told through a different cultural time and or area's lens. And I think that's why I personally very much appreciated this book. As someone who grew up really enjoying The Great Gatsby and a lot of the message there and things like that, I was very happy to see this take on it, and that it still held true to a lot of the underlying message about love and longing and unrequited love, but also gave a really nice and more upfront view of certain, perhaps subtler topics about dissidence in class and understanding of people.
Yeah, and of course, like, The Great Gatsby is one of those books that, like, I don't know, I feel like half of my friends, like, joke about hating The Great Gatsby just because it's one of those books that everybody had to read in high school. And
Yep.
so I'm actually curious. This is something I discussed with David a while back, but I think it might be interesting to bring to the discussion here. Like, what is, like, as like someone that grew up in the English school system, what is your relationship to The Great Gatsby?
So I didn't read Great Gatsby as like an assigned text at school. I did in my A level, so like 16 to 18 period of my education. We actually, ironically, just because of like the way that the curriculum works and the particular choices that my teachers that I had made, I actually did most of my like post 16 English literature education. A lot of that was actually focusing on American authors. We did a big like module on Sylvia Plath and the Beat Poets and sort of stuff around that. So I think I read The Great Gatsby as kind of a suggested reading list from like our teacher, but it wasn't actually something we did for study, sort of thing. And yeah, like I said, my memories of it were very dim. It has been many years since I last read it. Well, other than recently. So yeah, it was quite interesting coming back to it again, particularly like I said, in the lens of having seen all the characters again through Vo's writing. One of the things I was specifically interested in going back and sort of getting a feel for with Gatsby was the writing of the female characters in it, and I thought that was quite obviously. I think they're definitely given a bit more depth and a bit more detail in Vo's book, obviously, especially Jordan, but Daisy as well. But I think the thing that I found interesting on that is I think the level of sympathy I felt certainly for Daisy's character wasn't changed much by either representations. I'll put it that way.
It's a little bit hard to feel bad for either her or her husband.
I was actually going to interject. I think perhaps some of my background and where I come from, definitely not a large bit of sympathy, but there is definitely a token of ache for not only Tom, but for women of a certain station and a certain placement. Not necessarily particularly for Daisy, but for the Daisies and things like that. That I particularly felt. I think a lot of times, and not without just cause, there is a strong amount of vilification of the Daisy character in Great Gatsby. And to state it so simply that, in such a way without, again, bringing some further context to like being a Daisy and what society therefore does to you, which I think actually Vo does like a really lovely showing of in the book, much comparatively to like the actual Great Gatsby, giving some depth there, such as to bring up specifically the engagement dinner that happens, where we see like that first major paper crafting. I think really brings out and flushes that out just a little bit. Again, I think it also underscores this difference in society and in classes that sort of situates us or most people to not want to feel that for that person. But I think it can be seen there.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a very good point. It is like, I think we definitely see more of the motivation and the context for Daisy in Vo's book, and I think that's very important. Absolutely, I thought that was very well done. Like you said, especially that whole that's one of the most, I think, and I feel like that feels like one of the most divergent bits in the two books is that specific evening and how it is in both. I think everything else feels like, aside from obviously the more explicit sexuality in Vo's book, everything else feels like it's more or less, it might have a slightly different perspective, but it's the same, whereas that is one thing that is like explicitly written to be a different thing almost, I feel.
I would agree. Yeah, I think it's almost like a pivotal point where it's not just a retelling and it sort of becomes its own item, is in that scene.
Yeah, and I wanted to check in with you, Maria. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
I don't have to the original question about like the choice of retelling Great Gatsby. I don't know if I have anything to add on that, but I think like talking about like sympathy for Daisy, I feel like the timing of when I read the original versus now also had an impact on whether or not I felt more sympathy or anything for Daisy, because I feel like reading it in high school, there was still a lot of that, like, I don't really like Daisy because she's like, I don't know, doing all of these like traditionally feminine things, which are like almost frowned upon by like if you wanted to be a cool person or like not be a girly girl in quotation marks. But I think like now as an adult seeing and like having grown more and just being like, Daisy is in a way, there's more acceptance of how, like what Kay was saying, like the way that of the Daisies in the world, like not looking down upon or feeling more sympathy for the people whose life has shaped them in this way, or this is what they have grown up in, and this is the world of like the socialite whose life is to marry and have a kid or whatever. Like I think kind of like it wasn't vilified in any way. I don't think it was vilified, but I don't remember enough of the original Daisy. I just remembered that I was like, Daisy is also there in the original book.
Yeah.
That was me as a child.
Yeah, she's very much an object chalice in the original, in a way that I think there is some more life breathed into her in Vo's story. Whereas, I think very simply, there's a very common. I'm dealing with a cold that I'm at the end of, so my brain's a little fuzzy and I can't remember the word for it. But we could very simply have replaced Daisy in the original Great Gatsby in a lot of ways with a golden chalice. And I think it's not exact as certain other pieces of literature, but the life that's breathed into her, I think, in Vo's story versus what we see in the original Gatsby makes her a lot more of a compelling character and makes her situation a little more explicitly, understandable to the reader.
Although there is that still running over people with a car thing.
Oh, yeah.
That it's just like,
Oh yeah, no, she's
I don't
in
know.
no way, no way a good person
Yeah.
at all. Especially, I was doing a reread of some of the last bits early this afternoon. That moment right towards the end where she is speaking with Jordan, and she's like, and she was making these terrible noises, and I'm like, this is a person's death cry as she's trying to survive, and she's like, and it was terrible, and I'm like, maybe you could have helped her instead of just like, okay.
Yeah, that was actually like my first read. That was actually one of the points. Like the ending was kind of the thing that I was getting stuck on a little bit, because I was actually a little bit surprised how closely Vo decided to like cleave to the ending, particularly because the ending of The Great Gatsby is, and this is spoilers here for folks of either book, is just so convoluted. And it just kind of felt like Vo had to kind of bend backwards a little bit to like fit that into her novel a little bit. And that was kind of one of the things where I was like, how much do I like her like pulling on the Gatsby this much? Like I almost felt like it would have been better if she had broken from it a little bit there. But that's just kind of my peeve with the book that I otherwise quite liked.
I will say I definitely feel that. I think there was a part of me that was yearning for a different ending, that wanted a little more. But at the same time, I think there's a part of me that really appreciated that she stood firmly in what I think the measure of The Great Gatsby is, which is it's a tale about the death of the American dream and an unrequited love. And like I don't know if she would have been true to the themes of the book if she hadn't let us stand firmly in that sort of unrequited love and sort of that sadness, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I think I'd agree as well that I think it would have felt like fanficky in a bad way rather than in a good way. If it had just been like, let's give the Great Gatsby a happy ending, I feel like that would have kind of underwritten everything else that had been done up to that point. It's all very much bound up into the sort of the class politics and stuff that the novel's talking about. And yeah, I feel like there's probably not much that could have been done with the ending that wouldn't have undercut that part of the book.
Yeah, and continuing from what Kay and David you were saying there, we talked a lot about kind of the ways that Jordan and Daisy were expanded on, but I also found it kind of interesting that there were these background questions of like race and passing that like the Western outsider status in this is also kind of bound up with a leaving your hometown almost, where you are always going to be seen as a POC to a place where you can pass as white, which is sort of what ends up, and this is again spoilers here, so feel free to skip this, kind of what underlies both kind of Nick's and Gatsby's character in this book.
I mean, I think it's kind of interesting how like there is a lot of emphasis of where people are from in like the sense of like the Midwest, like the St. Paul Caraways or whatever they were, and like where like even all of the family, like where the families are from, but then also coming from like Jordan as like a Vietnamese adoptee, like the question of like where is one's origin and what does one bring from that origin, or if you're like taken from your place of origin. Like I think I hadn't thought about this before, but like now I want to think about like almost what are, if there are parallels between or not parallels between people like Nick and Daisy who are from not New York to Jordan, who was like raised in a completely different place than where she was born, but like has been raised in that culture. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I think one of the most evocative sort of situations of that I found really interesting in the book is this idea that where you're from, no matter where you go, will always shape you. Where like, so like the fact that Jordan, she says Tonkin, she doesn't say Vietnam at first. at least for a really long time, and how despite everything that shaped her both physically, but also in her magic and her craft and where that brought her. But then you have this really great line where Daisy talks about wanting to move to Philadelphia because she would love a place that made Gatsby. Just because it made Gatsby, there must be something wonderful about it. And I think if you take that into context, and like when she's talking to Jordan about how you think about Jordan, because there's a lot of, again, this sort of idea at first of like savagery and being saved and the white savior complex, where like Jordan thinks back to where she's from and these beautiful sort of places and what could have been there as they like created these things, and this idea that just as, you know, a place could have created Gatsby, and because it created Gatsby, it was beautiful, and it you know, was seated in him despite all he overcame. It would be similar for Jordan.
Yeah, and I think that also kind of, you're making me think that there are also like these discussions of like veins of magic in the book, but there's infernal magic, there's hoodoo, there's
native magic.
Yeah, there are these like veins of magic that sort of exist and scaffold like the existing kind of historical forces and power structures in the world. But I feel like there's also the implication that there are these other magics out there that are kind of, like you were saying a little bit with this return to Philadelphia, offer alternative, like the possibility, if not like something we see actually borne out, of alternative histories, alternative trajectories.
I think actually one of my favorite things is a bit of a side thing, but I do want to state this, is I love the fact that magic is a curtain dressing. It's not, you know, I feel like a lot of times when magic or something like that is in a book, a large part of that book is about the world of magic. But the fact that it is such a level of just curtain dressing that it's just there, and it helps to sort of heighten certain aspects of characters instead of sort of becoming a character in and of itself, like it sort of does in a lot of stories in general, was a really fantastic choice of Vose in making it, again, parallel to the original instead of wholly something, you know, fan fictional or something like that. It was really done with a delicate enough touch that it was there and it was present and it was fantastic. I loved the magic in this book, but it wasn't overwhelming.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward. I think next year she's releasing another book that is set in 1920s Hollywood that I'm looking forward to.
But yeah, no, I just wanted to say as well. Yeah, I think that was one of the things I really liked, and kind of like the way that the magic, like I said, it tells us interesting things. It gives an interesting texture to the world, but it doesn't. No plots particularly resolve on it. There's no functional difference between, you know, the fact that Nick that Gatsby has done a deal with the devil for wealth rather than, you know, selling bootleg liquor. It doesn't change anything, but that doesn't stop it from being. It feels part of the story. It feels part of the world. It feels like it has a place there, but it's not important in the sense that it changes the plot. It just gives it a different, like I said, a different feel, a different that kind of almost. It's almost like sort of the personifying the kind of, you know, metaphorical magic of the Jazz Age, in the fact that there is actual magic. And I think that's, yeah, it's a really interesting way that it does a lot for the story without doing much for the story, if that makes sense.
I agree entirely. I think what it really does is it highlights the characters. It brings out certain perspectives of them or viewpoints, like the fey dreaminess of Daisy, the infernalness, and then I also really like is that it highlights some of the characters in different ways by the lack of it. Like I'm struggling to recall, but I don't think we ever saw Tom directly engage with magic. The way the magic sort of reflects on different characters. I'm going to take a sharp turn to something that I think was really interesting, and that I haven't parsed how I feel about it, despite rereading that specific section a couple of times. spoilers again. It's like for the millionth time if you haven't read this book. How did people feel about Nick being a paper soldier?
I honestly did not see it coming. Although there was that dream after like the scene happened. It's like, oh, was this like pointing at this? I don't know. I think I have to read it again to come up with a stronger feeling about it. It made for a very cool scene. I will put that.
Yeah, I think I'd agree. I think it's definitely something I would like to go back and kind of, much like I did reading The Great Gatsby after having read it. I think I would like to go back now again after having read both it and The Great Gatsby and go back and read this again if time allows, sort of thing. Because yeah, I think like I said, there's just some of those subtleties that I think didn't. I'd be interested to see how much I pick up on them in the text, having read it once, sort of thing.
Yeah, knowing that it happens.
To a certain degree, it's almost poking fun a little bit at the original Nick and Gatsby, who is in some sense a little bit of like an empty character. Like he's the guy that goes around seeing things, but he doesn't really ever seem to do much in the novel. He's just kind of this impressionable like observer of events and commentator. But at the same time, it does kind of like it's sort of getting back to what I was kind of thinking about, was that there are these kinds of attempts to like craft alternatives through magic to the way the world existed or happened. And I felt like that's a little bit what is with Nick, that he isn't Nick, he's just this act of will on behalf of like a great grandmother, family legacy that is acting in the world through magic.
I like that. Yeah, it's interesting. I find myself like back and forth. I think it's interesting because I think it actually in essence sort of did that, but I think it also gave a little more to Nick in the moment with the heart, with the names scrawled. I liked the fact that it was not Nick's conscious choice to remove that from himself. It's like you have Jordan wanting to, in a sense, give him this fresh start and also give him a fresh start, but also not be tied down. And so she gives that plain heart with nothing on it except for an edge of her emotion inside of him. And yeah, I think it's one of the few things that I think if I have time, I'd like to give a reread, see if I pick up on it more, but I do like the I do like the way it makes me think and the curiosity it develops, because it was something that definitely took me from left field. I was like, the heck? Like I was like, I didn't expect it. Was almost jarring in a sense, which was sort of good because I think we had hit a point where it was so similar. We were reaching those similar levels to the other book. To have something kind of come out of left field and smack you in the face was a good thing.
The title is, of course, a reference to another Fitzgerald novel, The Beautiful and the Damned, which, of course, is funny because there are a lot of damned people in this novel. But, like, there is a lot of kind of, I think, interesting here about, like, how it is the chosen. And it is in a lot of ways about several characters who are just kind of, their lives are chosen for them by other people. That is like a thing that Jordan comes back to a lot about her past, that like her adopted mother is like, well, I chose you. You were the best one.
Best baby.
Yes.
Yeah, as I always found that to be an interesting thing. I'm not adopted, but I have a cousin who is. She was adopted from Russia. And this whole idea of like gotcha day and you were chosen and things like that, and how that is parsed out again in this book. I think that, and in the moments where she talks about feeling both chosen but also thrown aside in like Nick's heart, for example.
Yeah, and I'm kind of thinking then that creates an interesting parallel with the ending, because in some sense she explicitly says, I'm choosing not to adopt Nick as mine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the fact that she does make that choice, I think, is really interesting, because in a sense it's almost a choosing of self and a choosing of heritage over the sort of whiteness and Midwestern background that was a part of her life growing up, because she doesn't just become, Mrs. Nick Carraway, which would have been very easy. Instead, she decides to sort of stand on her own feet and she doesn't directly go to Vietnam. She goes to Shanghai with further intentions to go to Vietnam, explicitly stated in the book.
She also gives that $20 to the ghost and basically says, this is where you can find Daisy and Tom. Like, there's also that I'm not letting them like abandon their past as they want to.
Yeah, I guess that's sort of going back to what I was saying earlier about, like, yeah, that, not giving it a happy ending, obvious, but I guess that is one thing that it does do, is it gives an ending where something happens, which is kind of absolutely not the case in the original. It very much gives the you're very much left with the impression that everything is just going to carry on exactly as it was before, with no real change. Whereas at least in this, at least in this, Jordan is making changes in her life, even if perhaps a lot of what else is going on is still going to remain the same.
I think that I wish that there was a little bit more of world building, or like a little bit more about like what ghosts can do in the world. Like, we'd seen them a few times in the house and such, and then that scene with the ghost at the end happened, and it was like, what is this going, at least in my head, it's like, this is a little weird. Is what exactly is going to happen with this ghost? And yeah, for me, it didn't have as much of a clear, this is definitely going to happen next thing. But maybe I just need to reread parts with ghosts in them. I don't know.
There's definitely a few kind of world building things at the very end that are a little bit, I'm not sure how much we're meant to read them literally, like where she goes around the Asham palaces and there are parrot-headed men. And I'm like, are there actually parrot-headed men living out in this world that we haven't seen until now? Or is this like she's just so high in demoniac right now that she is seeing the true nature of things?
Yeah. I think it was also like just the amount of demoniac that had been consumed. It was like, how much of this is literal here? That was unclear to me, but maybe it makes sense in the way that the end of the book is sort of all mashed together and almost dreamy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think sort of harkening back to what David was saying, it does give you a little more something to chew on in regards to the fact that Daisy and Tom just don't happily ever after, because you have that very solid harmful break to Daisy where Jordan says no. And Jordan, instead of like giving Daisy what she wants and going with her, she decides no, she's going to pick herself. And you see that those are direct consequences to the fact of how Jordan feels about how Daisy treats her hit and run and treats the people around her and what's happened, which is, you don't see that in The Great Gatsby. You don't get that sort of thing. It's just like they go off by. They live, they move on with their lives, which is sort of a bit of a point in The Great Gatsby that is important, I think. But the fact that we have this other book and in this retelling, I think it's a different sort of powerful force and perhaps shows a reflective change in society from like Fitzgerald's times to ours.
One of the things that struck me was the scene where Jordan goes with Kai and like the circus, the performers, and like that whole thing where it's very awkward because she doesn't know what's being like said. And like stories are like the story of, I forgot, the dragon and like the woman. Like it's like she feels like she sees people who look like her, but she doesn't understand what's going on. I just thought that was a very interesting insight into like who Jordan is, because she feels so much like, or she maybe thinks of herself so much like as the other people that don't look like her when she's living her socialite life. So I just thought that was an interesting way of showing that in the book. I also just really enjoyed the different ways that the speakeasies were hidden. That was fun.
yeah, that was one of the things I did. I sort of already mentioned, but I really liked how the sort of the decadence of, you know, the jazz age and all sort of thing, like tied really nicely with this like over the top kind of you know, yeah, like magical trappings, and the you know, that's, well, I mean, I suppose it's more, you know, it's obviously it's more Gatsby's side of things, it's more or demony, but that sort of like, you know, fey eternal party sort of thing going on. And I just thought like the imagery of all that was really cool to sort of tap onto that, and the different clubs they go to, and the all that sort of thing. I thought was I really liked, and very evocative, and even like that bit you mentioned where it becomes more, or where it becomes less certain what's actually real and what is just, you know, demon hallucinations. But yeah, that whole bit with the kind of, when she goes on sort of the demoniac bender was really cool as well. I really like that whole sort of section. I think there's just a lot of nice imagery and inspiration in all of that sort of part of it.
Yeah, that's really good. I also found the clubs really wonderfully designed and very interesting. But actually, Ria reminded me something that I thought was brilliant in this book, which was the sort of adoption dilemma that happens with POC individuals, and the fact that it doesn't matter where she goes, she is always other, because she is othered in, you know, in this Midwestern scene with the others, because she's Vietnamese, she has a darker complexion, she is adopted. But there's that moment where Jordan's like, I can control that narrative, whereas she felt like she couldn't control, and it's like she could hone that into a weapon when she was with the Midwesterners, whereas instead it left her feeling rather dull when she's like, I don't like to go to Chinatown, and the fact that she felt so lost when she was with the individuals from the circus, because she may look like she belongs there, but she does not have those stories, that shared past, that understanding of where she's from. And it sort of leads her in this sort of really precarious place that I think is a really well done highlighting of that sort of struggle of an individual who is adopted from one culture into another, where there is a physical differentiation based on typically race.
Speaking from like, I'm not an adoptee, but I was like, I immigrated to the US when I was super young. So like that feeling of being like, when I visit the Philippines, it's like, I look like I am Filipino, but there's also like the disconnect of like what goes on in your head is like, you don't feel like you belong. Like that was a cool, like it was, I'm so excited about like how it feels like literature nowadays has been talking a lot about like, or it feels like diasporic literature and stuff like that is more available now. So it's being able to see that experience like on paper, even though it's not exactly the same kind of experience, but that sort of that thinking was very like, it's nice to see people think through this in fiction, because it's a thing that people think about in real life too. But yeah, that was part of why I was like, I like this book. And it deals with that sort of stuff.
Yeah, it makes me think, have you read Blackwater Sister? It was another kind of book that came out this year that that touches on, like, the protagonist is returning to Malaysia because effectively her parents lost their jobs and they just can't afford to live in the United States anymore.
Well, this is going on my to be read list. Thank you.
But no, yeah, that was definitely something I was thinking about, that I felt like a lot of the writing for Jordan was like, even like was definitely I felt like meant to make specific commentaries on, like, I guess, the contemporary experience of being kind of interracially adopted. Well, not even just necessarily interracially adopted, but like transatlantically adopted. Because I was forgetting, like, both you and Kay or Maria, both of you are more in academia than I am these days. I left like years ago. Because like I was thinking, like, I felt like it was like about 5 or so years back, but there was a lot of writing in like Asian American studies about transatlantic adoption, particularly because that was about the period where all those transatlantic adoptees were starting to go to college. And so the professors were interacting with them more. And that is something I remember being a thing, like when I was just about leaving grad school, that was going on.
I feel like my academia was the sciences, so I didn't
That's
really
okay.
attract
I don't know what modes of academia both of you are in. I just know both of you have some.
Yeah, I think that's quite accurate. I had I had a dual major in English and Classical Civilizations with a minor in Legal Studies, and it was very interesting. I actually had a young woman who was living on my floor who she is of Asian heritage, but she was adopted by a Russian Jewish couple. And I remember it was very interesting because I had a couple classes with her, one of which was a Russian fairy tale and folklore class. And we had spoken about it a bit, but there was a lot of adoptees and a lot of transatlantic adoptees sort of in my years in college and in some of my classes. And we had some of those lenses be quite prevalent. And also it was very interesting because I had a professor whose daughter was also adopted from, I want to say, South Korea. And you definitely saw some of those highlightings becoming much more things that I doubt were talked about, when my mother was in school in the 70s and such. And yeah, it's definitely a much more highlighted topic now, I think, and something that is discussed because it is more prevalently in our histories. I think it's a really important part of the Jordan character because it helps create her in this really unique vacuum to sort of, for lack of a better word, judge everyone else and to have her own opinions and sort of viewpoints that we might not have seen should she not have taken this form as a international adoptee and instead was still just a white character.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think it's that, in many ways she does act as that sort of like the kind of like reader insert character. I forget what the terminology is, but yeah, the who's almost there to act as a lens to see what happens through, much like Nick is in the original. But yeah, she's a much more interesting character in her own right as well. And like I said, yeah, the perspective she has in that outsider status are much more pointed, I suppose, than, because obviously, like I think even with Nick, he to the scenes that he is in, he is still an outsider, and so you still get that same sort of idea of like, okay, this is how you as the reader are being kind of introduced to what life is like in this very particular social strata sort of thing. But yeah, the character of Jordan has a much more interesting perspective to come from, and a much more interesting perspective to have insights on how all the characters interact, and how the class and stuff interact. I think that's really really good foundation, as it were, to start from.
And is this thing implied or like said in the book that like Jordan's birth parents were alive when Eliza took her or adopted her, or did I just like read that?
It's a little bit vague, like whether like she actually like paid for her, or if, because it seems like her parents turned it down. So I'm curious then if like it's implied not just that like she adopted her, but she kidnapped her and took her with her.
Yeah. Like I was always, reading that, I was like, is this how I should be reading this? Is there like malevolence? Like it is a little like, should I be reading it with that sort of motive, and how Eliza Baker is always like, you're my favorite and that's why I took you? Or
yeah, it's weird. I feel like it's not explicitly stated in the book. You're led to question it, but I don't think you're given an answer, which I actually really like, because Jordan wouldn't actually get an answer. There's no way for her to know. And so the fact that we don't get some definitive authorial line being like, yep, she was kidnapped, is important because, again, we are sort of viewing through the lens of Jordan, and we therefore will view with that same unanswered confusion. of like, did she actually like save her from an orphanage, or did she just kidnap her from her parents? Like, we don't know that. And I think that's also a really sort of interesting perspective against this white saviorism, in the sense that a lot of people that have sort of essentially been like through white saviorism don't actually know, like, was this actual plight or was this cruelty? There's been some really interesting reform in adoption in the last like half a decade or so, or decade, in regards to this, because there's been so many people that have found that were in that situation where essentially like their children were kidnapped to feed this adoption market that wanted, you know, people from this, or whereas there was misunderstandings where it wasn't properly explained to parents that they weren't just placing their kids in the orphanage to be fed a while. These kids were going to get shipped off to other families. And so I think that was, a very interesting backdrop there, where you have these children, and you know, maybe she did love her and adored her and wanted to give her this better life, which she surely probably did have than she might have had back in Vietnam, under whatever the circumstances there were. But was there a family that wanted her and loved her and would have cared for their to the best of their abilities in Vietnam is a really sort of interesting underlining there.
Or like to speculate completely, like what if like it was Jordan being taken to America that was like the sign of someone's American dream, or like that this was what could have been seen as her parents' sacrifice to like have her live somewhere. But like that's entirely speculation, just going off the Gatsby and the American dream thing.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. And I really sort of like that backdrop against this idea of the two major themes, like the American dream, but also love and unrequited love, and this misunderstanding of love that I think is so prevalent in Gatsby, but also in The Chosen and the Beautiful. Because one of the things that I've always loved about it is the fact that it speaks to the ineptitude of love, or what people believe is love, and what people want out of love. Because like it would have been so easy, especially in this setting, when Gatsby, you know, because he's not a bootlegger. He makes a demonic pact to get him all these things. But the thing is, had this sort of like weird mix of both hubris and desire, where he doesn't just make a demonic pact for Daisy, because he could very simply make a demonic pact for Daisy and be like, okay, here's my soul. I want Daisy. Give me Daisy. Instead, he gets this power and this wealth, because what he wants and what he thinks he has is he wants Daisy to come to him. And he's like, I will, because he thinks that what is wrong with their love, or what isn't there, is his failings to be wealthy and give her the life that she wants. And that if she would love him, if only he was wealthy, and she would have picked him over Tom. And I think it was very interesting to instead have this moment where she doesn't. You know, like he built her this beautiful golden birdhouse, and she wouldn't come. You know, and despite everything he did or thought he did, he wanted her love to be given freely, and it wasn't.
So yeah, since we've hearing about like the second hour here, something I wanted to turn the discussion over to a little bit was that I personally had set things up for this to run with Urban Shadows. But something I was also thinking about was other games that like might fit this, because I have things I like and don't like about Urban Shadows fitting with this. But Maria, it was a game I'm not super familiar with, so I want to ask you what do you think of doing Good Society with a Roaring 20s setting?
Okay, it's been done. And also,
Okay.
I was thinking as I was reading this book, I was like, this could also work with Good Society, because it's a lot of people visiting each other's houses. I think you could definitely change the play set and just like the setting and collaboration to do like a 1920s. You could even use like the Pride and Practical Magics expansion, which brings in more like the magical part. There's a mini expansion that has like fey courts involved, so you could get some of like the faction of the fey courts in there. But I think it would be easily doable to, if you at some point wanted to try a 1920s magical supernatural game using the Good Society sort of system that would work, because I was definitely reading it being like, I can also see.
Oh man, I was supposed to play Good Society with the Practical Magic edition, and I was so excited, and then the game fell apart because of people's shenanigans. I've never gotten to play Good Society, but hopefully one day.
One day I will put another game up. But it is, yeah, I think it's a good game for if you just have a lot of like interpersonal stuff going on. But like epistolary seems a little not something that would transfer over super well.
Yeah.
If you stick to writing letters, you could do like some of the Emma expansion epistolary, which is like monologues and stuff. But I could talk about Good Society forever, so I'm shut up.
You can make the letters into phone calls, which would be a very fun little adaptation considering phone call in this book and how they work with this setting. Also, I'm that person, so I'm going to say this would be very fun or could have been very fun, depending on comfort levels, and if we made everyone 18-year-old seniors for Monster Hearts.
Yeah, kind of going back almost to that, you know, the bits with Jordan and
just doing the St. Louis prequel.
Daisy and exactly.
Yeah,
just like just roll to turn someone on, you put lipstick on them. Sorry, it was like the first scene I read, and I was like, I'm here for this book.
Yeah, no, I love that. I also want to put everything in Monster Hearts because I love Monster Hearts.
Did you read the particular about the author for The Chosen and the Beautiful?
Yeah, yes. And this is why I got to read all of her other stuff.
Oh, I did not. What does it say?
It was like she believes in the power of lipstick or something.
She believes in the ritual of lipstick, the power of stories, and the right to change your mind.
Yeah.
Ooh, I like that.
Very good author bio.
That is a sentence I need in life.
I can definitely see this game. I can definitely see the kind of the social aspects of the book working really nicely with Good Society, possibly with some of the some tweaks to like the drives and stuff, because they're very different. But that aside, but I think. Going back to the Urban Shadows thing, I think Urban Shadows would do a really good job of exploring the world, if not necessarily the specific thematic touch points of the book itself, if that makes sense.
And I think you can touch upon those also in Urban Shadows. I think there are obviously some pretty easy one-for-one sort of, for lack of a better word, like classes or books that can sort of hedge into certain characters and their desires and their beliefs, like the Tainted or the Imp can really easily analogous there for some Gatsby's characters and creating that sort of longing and wanting.
Yeah, and for me, like one of the reasons I was kind of drawn to using Urban Shadows for this, well, first off was because I personally, the thing that I dislike about some urban fantasy is that there's like this insistence on we need to make all the magic secret and have it like be this completely discrete world from mortality rather than having crossover with it to some degree, which I sometimes find a little bit of a slightly tired trope in urban fantasy. I like the idea here that there is, I think, still a fairly firmly defined mortality world within The Chosen and the Beautiful, but it's one whose boundary with the world of magic is a little bit more hazy.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, both like in urban fantasy in general, but yeah, specifically with that, it's like because the problem you have, I think the problem you have with a lot of urban fantasies, you kind of need that, you know, the masquerade or whatever it is to kind of put a bit of an edge to it. But also it's the question, it's like, well, if you learn magic by, and this is obviously where you get into the whole issues, but also why that happens with like the Harry Potter thing, where it's like if you can learn magic just by going and reading a book about magic and now you can do magic, then why doesn't everyone do magic? You know, if it's that powerful and that simple to do, then why doesn't it follow on that just a lot more people do it? So if you want that kind of idea of there being a kind of much smaller section of people who can do it, then you kind of need to bring in that privacy element. But I think you obviously see in here that there are social reasons why people don't do magic. There are still the vast majority of people think that it is evil and it is witchcraft and you should not do that stuff. And I think that's quite an interesting thing. I kind of agree with that, which also does tangent, but just made me think of it again because it touched on that. And I was thinking about it earlier, but I really want to see a mashup of the Between and Brindlewood Bay, where you all play like Jordan's aunt and her like magic fighting club or something that they seem to have that just gets very vaguely alluded to in the background of things, but they appear to be like witch hunters or something.
There was this text adventure that was kind of inspiring me. I wanted to do like a 1920s where you're all like rather than being grandmas, you're all like 1920s flappers like exorcising ghosts. There's a text adventure that came out called Zozzled, where you play a boozy 1920s flapper who kind of has, to her horror, a ghost has turned all of the alcohol in the speakeasy into water, which you refuse to drink. And so you need to go around exorcising ghosts by drinking them down. It's quite entertaining. But yeah, the other thing I liked about Urban Shadows for this was it is kind of a world where Urban Shadows sort of implies a world where everybody kind of knows each other. And I felt like that carries over really nicely with the kind of both like that you can have someone very well, but you don't know that they're like also a part of this completely other like world that you haven't been privy to. Which I feel like is a lot of the interplay between Nick and Jordan, that they both have these like, they both only really intersect a little bit, and they're both always a little bit surprised by each other.
Yeah. And I think as well, the way that the social worlds or the class experiences of the different characters, I mean, they don't necessarily like map on a one-for-one way to the circles or whatever they call them these days in Urban Shadows, but there is a kind of interplay there. I think like you could definitely see obviously like the Gatsby and the club type people being part of Night, and like Tom probably being part of Power, even if he himself isn't like magical, but there's still that idea of that entrenched like upper class controlling element, and other people representing Mortalis. And I feel like there's that sort of idea of these like separate but intersecting worlds kind of thing that Urban Shadows sort of plays with.
So I haven't played Urban Shadows before, but I've like been snooping through the character sheet and staring at the quick start. Like, are you playing characters who are like, how much influence do your characters have on like the politics and like the interactions between the different circles? Are you like sort of high level or low level? Like,
you are not like the lowest of low level. You are important enough that people know who you are, but you are like in terms of like there's like a status system in this game. You are status 1 characters, so you are like the lowest level of like influential people within your circle.
Okay. Yeah, that's cool. Because I was like thinking about it, like trying to figure out how this would play with the game as I was reading it. And one thing that was interesting is like how all the politics and like there's like a lot of politicking that happens in The Chosen and the Beautiful that's sort of like not in the forefront, but you see it talked about and like the different factions or whatever acting. So that was kind of me being like, is this how we're going to be playing in this with that in the background, or are we ourselves going to be making factions change what they do?
That's actually one of the reasons why I really like this game pick with the book, is because essentially it's very similar to that in the fact where we are these level 1. So we are people that may benefit from certain relations or things like that, but we're not in direct power. We may have someone's ear or something like that. And that feels so similar to Jordan's position and others' positions where, like, you know, we have Gatsby taking these phone calls he has to take, but he seems like he's like this big wig when in fact he still answers to someone, and you still have like those power plays. So it felt very real to the power dynamics in the game as would in this book.
For me, though, like the kind of, and this is kind of going over to why I was a little bit leery, and I've still been thinking through it, was that I feel like Urban Shadows, because it sort of inherits a lot from urban fantasy, which inherits a lot from noir, it's definitely a game where violence is a kind of genre assumption, and the willingness to resort to violence, which I feel like is definitely where it doesn't mesh with The Chosen and the Beautiful, because I feel like The Chosen and the Beautiful, violence is like the last tool. Like, I feel like there's definitely a certain playbooks, because you actually brought up the Tainted, and I feel like that's one of them. Like the Tainted, the Wolf, the Hunter, the Sworn, like each circle kind of has a particular playbook that is sort of built around being the member of that circle that kind of resorts to violence as their first tool. And I don't think it rules them out as playbooks, but I definitely think that I've been thinking about how would you kind of reconcile that with the kind of tone of The Chosen and the Beautiful.
So here's my sort of, I guess, counter to that, is I think they have the ability to have violence as their attribute, but they don't have to be. So like the Sworn is a good example there, because one of the objects of the Sworn, if I pull up the character sheet for the Sworn, where like there are ways in which you handle things or what you're responsible for, and they don't have to be like the things you're charged with. Could simply be negotiating with their allies and vassals and recovering lost artifacts and tomes. It does have a propensity to violence, but I've played in Urban Shadows games where it's entirely political, and it's all about talking and where you go to, and there really isn't much fighting, if at all. So I think that's one of my favorite things about the beauty of Urban Shadows is the fact that it's a game that doesn't need violence. It is perfectly able to handle violence, and you can interweave violence as part of the narrative there. But you don't need it, and the playbooks don't demand it.
That definitely helps kind of ground some of my thoughts about them, because there are definitely characters, I think, that they would not be interesting if they didn't have like a threat of violence built into them. Like, I think that's why they're influential, each of those playbooks. Within the setting, but it's definitely a lot like Gatsby. There's the implication that he is very powerful and very dangerous, but we never actually necessarily see him strike out at someone.
And I think that's kind of it. It's the we don't see much violence in either book, but it doesn't feel like it's antithetical to the tone of the book either, if that makes sense. It's not like kind of if we were playing say Steven Universe as an example off the top of my head, where introducing violence feels like it's very much against the ethos of the piece of media, whereas I feel like in this it's more that it doesn't come up, but it's not present. And I suppose things as well, like the sort of the references back to the war experience and all this stuff, it feels like that sort of element of violence is something that is around the margins of the book, even if it isn't a big focus, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks for that insight, David. That takes us to about the end of the time we have for the discussion. Thanks everyone for your insights on The Chosen and the Beautiful. I look forward to seeing the characters and setting we build from it next week. Thanks everyone who is watching. Bye!